Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when we're not looking for them at all. Sometimes a single moment in the desert can change everything we thought we knew about purpose and second chances. Eli Boone was 64 years old and thought his life had settled into its final rhythm, just him, his donkey, cricket, and the endless stretch of Arizona desert he'd called home for decades. But on an ordinary supply run along the canyon rim, he spotted something that shouldn't exist. 3 enormous letters carved into the sand below. SOS. What he found at the end of that desperate signal would challenge everything he believed about isolation, redemption, and what truly matters when time starts running out. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow I have something extraordinary waiting for you. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern ridge when Eli Boone stepped out onto the weathered porch of his adobe house. The air carried that particular coolness that comes just before the desert heat takes hold, and he breathed it in deeply, the way a man does when he's grateful for simple things. His boots made familiar sounds against the wooden planks, a rhythm he'd known for 37 years, ever since he and Sarah had built this place with their own hands. Cricket stood in the small corral, ears already perked forward, waiting. The donkey was grey around the muzzle now, pushing 20 years old, which made him ancient in donkey years, but still sturdy enough for the work they had left to do together. Eli approached the fence with a handful of oats, and Cricket ambled over with that unhurried dignity that donkeys possess. "Morning, old friend," Eli said, letting the animal eat from his palm. Cricket's whiskers tickled his weathered skin. "We've got a run to make today. Town won't supply itself." The small ranch sat in a bowl of red rock and scrub brush about 40 miles northeast of Sedona, far enough from civilization that Eli could go weeks without seeing another soul. That was how he preferred it these days. The solitude had been hard at first, after Sarah passed, but somewhere along the way it had become a comfort rather than a curse. Out here, there were no expectations, no small talk, no need to explain why he kept living in a place most people would consider God-forsaken. He saddled Cricket with practiced efficiency, securing the worn Navajo blanket Sarah had bought at a trading post during their first year of marriage. The colors had faded from vibrant reds and oranges to muted earth tones, but Eli couldn't bring himself to replace it. Some things you kept not because they were useful, but because they remembered for you. The ride into town would take most of the day. Eli had learned long ago to treat these supply runs as small journeys rather than chores. He packed carefully water for himself and Cricket, some jerky, an extra canteen, his battered copy of Lonesome Dove that he'd read maybe 15 times. He'd learned from the old-timers who'd ranched this country before him. Respect the desert, prepare for trouble, and never assume you know what the day will bring. By 7 o'clock, they were on the trail. The path wound through a maze of canyons and mesas, following routes that Eli knew by heart. He'd ridden this country for 4 decades, first as a young cowhand working for the Prescott Ranch, then as foreman, and finally as the owner of his own small piece of it. The land had marked him as surely as he'd marked it with fence posts and water tanks. Cricket's hooves clopped steadily against the packed earth. The morning warmed, and Eli pulled his hat lower against the climbing sun. He'd worn the same style of hat for 40 years, wide-brimmed, sweat-stained, practical. Sarah used to tease him about it, said he looked like he'd stepped out of an old photograph. Maybe he had. Maybe that was the point. They passed the old Mendoza, place around 9, or what was left of it. The family had given up and moved to Phoenix back in the 90s when the drought got bad. Now only the foundation remained, along with a windmill that still turned in the breeze, creaking like a lonely ghost. Eli had known Ramon Mendoza well, had shared many evenings on his porch, trading stories and whiskey. Good man. The desert took some people that way, wore them down until they had to choose between the land and everything else. Eli had made his choice long ago. The trail climbed toward the canyon rim, a route that would save him several miles by cutting across the high country. It was rougher going, but Cricket was sure-footed, and Eli enjoyed the view. From up here, you could see for 30 miles in every direction nothing but waves of stone and brush, painted in shades of rust and gold and amber. Most people looked at this landscape and saw emptiness. Eli saw home. He thought about Sarah often on these rides. They'd met in Flagstaff, at a rodeo where Eli was competing in the bronc riding. He'd been thrown within seconds, landing hard enough to knock the wind clean out of him. Sarah had been in the stands with her college friends, visiting from back east, and something about his complete failure had made her laugh. Not cruelly, but with genuine delight. When he'd limped past the bleachers afterward, she'd called out, "Better luck next time, Cowboy." They'd been married 6 months later. Her family thought she was crazy, throwing away a degree in library science to live in the middle of nowhere with a man who smelled like horses and had dirt under his fingernails. But Sarah never seemed to regret it. She'd made the adobe house a home, planted gardens that somehow thrived despite the heat, filled their evenings with books and conversation, and a kind of contentment that Eli had never known existed. Cancer took her 12 years ago, pancreatic, fast and mean. Eli had driven her to Flagstaff twice a week for treatments that didn't work, watched her fade despite every prayer and promise. In the end, she'd asked to come home, to spend her final weeks looking at the land she loved. He'd held her hand on the porch as the sun set behind the western ridge, and she'd told him not to leave this place, not to give up on it just because she was gone. He'd kept that promise. Cricket snorted, pulling Eli back to the present. They'd reached the high point of the rim, where the trail leveled out for a quarter-mile before descending again. This was Eli's favorite spot on the whole route, a place where the land opened up and you could see the ancient lake bed spreading out below, a vast white expanse of alkali flat that shimmered in the heat. Eli reined Cricket to a stop, letting them both rest. He pulled out his canteen and took a long drink, then poured some water into his hat for the donkey. While Cricket drank, Eli scanned the horizon out of habit. The way a man does when he's spent his life in open country. You learned to read the land, to notice changes, to spot things that didn't belong. That's when he saw it. At first, Eli thought the heat was playing tricks on him. The lake bed was more than a mile away, and the morning sun created all kinds of mirages and distortions. But he squinted, shaded his eyes, and looked again. 3 letters, enormous, carved or arranged somehow on the white surface of the ancient lake bed. SOS. Eli felt his heart rate pick up slightly. He'd been riding this trail twice a month for 15 years and had never seen anything like this. The letters had to be massive, maybe 30 feet tall, each to be visible from this distance. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create them. But who and why? The nearest road was 10 miles south. The lake bed itself was surrounded by rough country, accessible only on foot or horseback. Eli knew of maybe 3 or 4 people besides himself who even came out this way, and none of them had reason to be, spelling out distress signals. Cricket finished drinking and stamped a hoof impatiently. The donkey wanted to keep moving, to get on with the familiar routine of the supply run. But Eli sat motionless in the saddle, staring at those 3 letters that shouldn't exist. Every practical bone in his body said to continue on to town. He had supplies to buy, errands to run. Whatever was happening down on that lake bed wasn't his problem. He'd learned over the years that the best way to maintain his peaceful existence was to mind his own business and let the world handle its own troubles. But something nagged at him. Sarah's voice, maybe, from some deep corner of his memory. She'd never been able to pass by someone in need. Had driven him crazy sometimes, the way she'd stop to help stranded motorists or bring groceries to elderly neighbors who'd never asked for help. "We're all we've got out here," she used to say. "If we don't look out for each other, who will?" Eli checked his watch. It was just past 10. If he went down to investigate, he'd lose at least 2 hours, maybe more, depending on what he found. The supply run would have to wait until tomorrow. He sat there for a long moment, weighing his options, listening to the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Then he sighed, turned Cricket away from the town trail, and began picking his way down the rocky slope toward the lake bed. "Come on, old friend," he said to the donkey. "Let's go see what fool thing we're getting ourselves into." The descent was slow and careful. The terrain was all loose rock and scattered juniper, the kind of ground that could turn an ankle or throw a shoe if you weren't paying attention. Eli let Cricket set the pace, trusting the animal's instincts. They zigzagged down through a series of switchbacks, gradually losing elevation as the lake bed grew larger below them. It took nearly an hour to reach the bottom. By the time they arrived at the edge of the alkali flat, the sun was high and hot, and both man and animal were ready for another drink. Eli dismounted, gave Cricket some water, and studied the landscape ahead. From ground level, the SOS letters were even more impressive. They'd been created by arranging dark stones, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, against the white alkali surface. Each letter was at least 40 feet tall and carefully formed, with straight lines and precise curves. This wasn't the work of a few minutes. Someone had spent hours, maybe days, creating this signal. But where were they? Eli walked forward slowly, leading Cricket by the reins. The lake bed crunched under his boots, salt crystals catching the light. His eyes scanned the terrain, looking for any sign of movement, any indication of human presence. "Hello," he called out. His voice sounded small in the vast emptiness. "Anyone out here?" No answer, just the wind and the creak of Cricket's saddle. Eli continued forward, following the line of stones. Whoever had made this signal had to be nearby. You didn't go to this much trouble and then wander off. Unless something had gone wrong, unless they couldn't respond. That thought quickened his steps. Eli found her about 200 yards past the SOS, sheltered beneath a makeshift lean-to constructed from a sun-bleached tarp and several pieces of driftwood. At first glance, he thought he was looking at a pile of camping gear. Then the pile moved. She was older than he'd expected, 70 at least, maybe more. Her face was deeply tanned and lined, framed by silver hair pulled back in a loose braid. She wore dusty khaki pants and a long-sleeved shirt that had once been white but was now the color of desert sand. When she saw him approaching, she didn't call out or wave. She simply watched him come, as if she'd been waiting for this moment but wasn't quite sure it was real. "Ma'am," Eli said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I saw your signal from the rim. Are you hurt?" She blinked at him slowly, and he realized she was severely dehydrated. Her lips were cracked, her movements careful and deliberate. When she spoke, her voice came out as a rasp. "Water." Eli moved quickly, pulling his canteen from Cricket's pack. He knelt beside her and held it to her lips, tilting it carefully. "Easy now. Small sips. That's it." She drank greedily at first, then seemed to remember herself and pulled back. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, despite her condition, studied him with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "Thank you," she said, her voice already stronger. "I wasn't certain anyone would see it. The signal. I've been working on it for 3 days. 3 days." Eli looked at the elaborate stone letters and tried to imagine this elderly woman hauling rocks in the desert heat for 72 hours. The effort alone should have killed her. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. 19 days. She said it matter-of-factly, as if commenting on the weather. "My Jeep broke down about 8 miles. Southeast of here. Transmission, I think. I tried to walk out, but I'm not as young as I used to be. Got turned around, ended up here. By the time I realized how lost I was, going back seemed just as dangerous as going forward. 19 days in the desert." Eli felt a chill despite the heat. He'd seen what this country could do to people in far less time. "Do you have any supplies? Food? More water?" She gestured weakly toward her lean-to. "I had 3 gallons when I started walking. Been rationing it. Ran out yesterday morning. There's some canned goods left, but I haven't been able to eat much without water. Eli stood and examined her makeshift shelter. It was surprisingly well constructed, angled to provide maximum shade during the hottest part of the day. Inside, he found a backpack, a sleeping bag, several empty water containers, and a battered metal case about the size of a large briefcase. Various tools were scattered about: a small camp shovel, a rock hammer, what looked like surveying equipment. "You're a geologist," he said. It wasn't a question. Was. Retired. Margaret Chen. She attempted a smile. "Though I suppose retired is a relative term when you find yourself stranded in the painted desert." Eli introduced himself and offered her more water, which she accepted gratefully. As she drank, he studied her setup more carefully. This wasn't some tourist who'd gotten lost on a day hike. Everything she'd brought was professional grade, well maintained. She'd come out here with a purpose. "Dr. Chen, Margaret, please. Margaret, what brought you out to this particular piece of nowhere?" She was quiet for a moment, and Eli saw something flicker across her face. Determination, maybe, or defiance. "I'm documenting sites," she said finally. "Sacred sites, geological formations, archaeological markers, places that are about to disappear." Disappear? Margaret reached into her shelter and pulled out the metal case. She opened it with careful hands, revealing a thick stack of papers, photographs, and maps. Her fingers trembled slightly, whether from weakness or emotion. Eli couldn't tell. "There's a mining company," she said. "Hearthstone Resources. They've purchased mineral rights to 70,000 acres in this region, lithium deposits, apparently quite extensive. They're planning to begin extraction operations within the year." Eli felt something tighten in his chest. He knew about lithium mining, the open pits, the chemical processing, the way it transformed landscape into industrial wasteland. He'd seen what it did to places up in Nevada. "And these sites you're documenting will be destroyed. All of them." Margaret's voice was steady now, stronger. "Ancient petroglyphs that the Hopi and Navajo tribes have held sacred for centuries. Fossil beds that contain species found nowhere else on Earth. Spring systems that feed wildlife for 100 miles in every direction. None of it will survive the mining operation." She pulled out a photograph and handed it to Eli. It showed a rock wall covered in elaborate pictographs, spirals and handprints, and figures that seemed to dance across the stone. "This panel is 3 miles from here," Margaret said. "Created sometime between 900 and 1200 AD. It's a calendar, a star chart, and a teaching tool, all in one. The tribal elders have been trying to get it protected for 20 years. The company's lawyers have blocked them at every turn." Eli studied the photograph, then looked at Margaret. She was watching him with those sharp eyes, waiting to see how he'd respond. "And you thought you could make a difference? One person with a camera and a notebook?" "I thought I could create a record," she said, "something that would outlast the company's lawyers and politicians' promises. I'm not naive, Mr. Boone. I know the mining will probably happen. But I'll be damned if these places disappear without anyone bearing witness to what was lost." There was steel in her voice. Now, a core of strength that had nothing to do with physical endurance. Eli recognized it because he'd heard it in Sarah's voice when she talked about things that mattered. Some people couldn't be dissuaded once they'd decided something was right. "You came out here alone," he said, "at your age, into country that kills experienced outdoorsmen." "I did. That was foolish. Probably." Margaret managed a weak smile. "But I've been foolish before. It's gotten me through 73 years so far." Eli shook his head, but he found himself smiling slightly despite the circumstances. He pulled out his canteen again and offered it to her. "Well, Dr. Margaret Chen, foolish or not, you're alive. Let's see if we can keep you that way. How's your health otherwise? Any injuries? Medical conditions I should know about?" Nothing serious. Some blisters, dehydration obviously. My left knee is problematic, but it's been problematic for 30 years. I'm tougher than I look. She'd have to be, Eli thought, to survive 19 days out here. He glanced at the sun, calculating time and distance. His ranch was closer than town, maybe 6 or 7 hours if they took it slow. Margaret could ride Cricket while Eli walked. They'd need to rest frequently, make sure she didn't overexert herself. "Can you travel?" he asked. "If it means getting out of here, I can sprout wings and fly. Might be easier than what I've got in mind. My place is northwest of here, up in the high country. We can make it before dark if we start now, but it won't be comfortable." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to help me. I'm going to help you. Even though I'm a foolish old woman who got herself into this mess." "Especially because of that," Eli said. "My wife would haunt me from the grave if I left you out here." Something softened in Margaret's expression. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." She was. Eli stood and began gathering Margaret's essential supplies. "Come on, we've got some ground to cover, and I'd rather do most of it before the afternoon heat hits full force." He helped Margaret to her feet, steadying her when she swayed slightly. She was thinner than he'd realized, her frame bird-like under the layers of dusty clothing. But when she straightened, there was dignity in her bearing, a quiet pride that reminded him of the old desert itself, weathered but unbroken. "Mr. Boone," she said as he helped her toward Cricket, "when we get to safety, when I'm recovered, I need to come back out here. I need to finish documenting these sites." Eli paused in the act of adjusting Cricket's saddle. "You nearly died out here." "I know, but the work isn't done." He looked at her, this stubborn old woman who'd spent 3 days building a stone SOS while dying of thirst, and recognized something he'd almost forgotten. The kind of purpose that makes a person willing to risk everything. "Let's get you home first," he said quietly. "We'll worry about the rest later." Margaret nodded and allowed him to help her mount Cricket. As Eli gathered the last of her essential gear, including that battered metal case full of maps and photographs, he found himself wondering what he'd just agreed to. He'd come out here expecting to find a lost hiker or maybe a broken-down vehicle. Instead, he'd found something far more complicated. A mission, a cause, and a woman who refused to let either one go. The journey back was slow and careful. Eli led Cricket by the reins, setting a pace that wouldn't exhaust Margaret or the donkey. Every 20 minutes, he called for a rest, making Margaret drink water even when she protested that she'd had enough. The desert had taught him that thirst was a poor indicator of actual need. By the time you felt it badly, you were already in trouble. Margaret sat in the saddle with surprising grace for someone who'd been near death an hour earlier. She'd wrapped a spare cloth around her head to protect against the sun, and, despite her obvious fatigue, she kept her spine straight and her eyes alert. Every so often, Eli caught her studying the landscape, and he realized she was cataloging it, even now noting rock formations, vegetation patterns, the way light played across the stone. "You really love this country," he said during one of their rest stops. Margaret accepted the canteen he offered and took a measured sip before responding. "I've spent 40 years studying deserts around the world, the Atacama in Chile, the Gobi in Mongolia, the Namib in Africa. But this place," she gestured at the expanse of red rock and endless sky, "this is different. There's a story written in every layer of stone, going back hundreds of millions of years. Most people look at it and see wasteland. I see history." Eli found himself nodding. "My wife used to say something similar. She'd drag me out to look at sunsets and rock formations, make me slow down and actually see what I was walking through every day. I thought she was being romantic at first. Took me years to understand she was being accurate. She sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have." Eli felt the familiar ache that came whenever he talked about Sarah, but it was softer now, worn smooth by time. "She passed 12 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry." They fell into companionable silence. Eli found himself reaching into his shirt pocket, touching the small silver ring he kept there. Sarah's turquoise ring, the one she'd worn every day of their marriage until the chemotherapy made her fingers too thin to hold it. He'd carried it with him ever since, a talisman against forgetting. Margaret noticed the gesture. Her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "May I ask what you carry there?" she said gently. Eli hesitated, then pulled out the ring and held it up so she could see. The afternoon light caught the turquoise stone, bringing out flecks of green and gold in the blue. "Beautiful," Margaret said. "Local stone?" "From a mine up near Jerome. I bought it at a trading post on our first anniversary. Couldn't afford much back then, but Sarah said it was perfect." He turned the ring in his fingers, remembering. "She wore it for 31 years. And you've carried it for 12. Every day." Margaret was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "I lost my husband 16 years ago, heart attack. He was a geologist too, that's how we met, actually. Field work in Utah back in the 70s. He proposed to me on top of a mesa at sunrise. Most romantic moment of my life, and we were both covered in rock dust and hadn't showered in a week." Eli smiled despite himself. "Sounds about right. His name was David. We never had children, the work always came first, we told ourselves. There'd be time later, except there wasn't." She paused, looking out at the desert. "After he died, I threw myself into research. Published papers, consulted on projects, kept busy. But this," she touched the metal, "case strapped to Cricket's saddle. This is the first thing in 16 years that's felt like it mattered, really mattered. Documenting the sites, bearing witness, making sure someone remembers what was here before it's gone." Margaret's voice took on an edge of intensity. "David used to say that geology was the science of deep time, of understanding that the Earth's story is so much longer than ours. These sacred sites, these formations, they've been here for thousands of years. And they're going to be destroyed in a few months for lithium that will power phones and cars for a decade at most. The math doesn't add up." Eli considered this as they resumed walking. He'd never thought much about mining or development. It was something that happened elsewhere, to other people's land. But listening to Margaret, seeing the passion in her voice, he began to understand the scale of what was at stake. "How many sites are there?" he asked. "In the area that Hearthstone Resources has mineral rights to?" "At least 47 that I know of. Probably more that haven't been documented. Petroglyphs, pottery sites, fossil beds, spring systems, ceremonial grounds. Each one represents hundreds or thousands of years of history. And you're trying to document all of them? Alone?" "I was trying, before my Jeep decided otherwise." Margaret shifted in the saddle, favoring her left knee. "I'd completed surveys of 18 sites. I was on my way to the 19th when the transmission gave out." Eli did the math. 47 sites, 18 completed. Margaret had been working for at least 3 months, maybe longer, living out of her Jeep, traveling to remote locations that most people couldn't even reach, all for a project that might not make any difference at all. "You're as stubborn as Cricket here," he said. "I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The terrain gradually began to climb, leaving the alkali flats behind and entering broken country full of arroyos and scattered juniper. Eli adjusted their route to take advantage of shade wherever possible, and he made Margaret drink water every 15 minutes, whether she wanted it or not. Around 4 o'clock, they reached a small spring that Eli knew from decades of riding this country. It was barely more than a seep, hidden in a cleft of rock, but the water was clean and cold. He helped Margaret down from the saddle, and they both drank deeply, refilling the canteens. Margaret splashed water on her face and sighed with genuine relief. "I can't remember the last time anything felt this good." "We're about halfway," Eli said. "Another 3 hours, maybe 4. How are you holding up?" "I'm tired. My knee aches. I probably smell like something that died in the sun." She gave him a wry smile. "But I'm alive, which is more than I had any right to expect this morning. So I'd say I'm holding up just fine." Eli found himself genuinely liking this woman. There was a toughness to her that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with refusing to give up. He recognized it because he'd seen it in Sarah, in himself, in everyone who'd chosen to make a life in hard country. "When we get to the ranch," he said, "you'll rest for a few days, get your strength back. Then we can talk about what comes next. What comes next is I finish the survey work. Margaret, I mean it, Eli. I didn't come this far to quit with half the job done." He looked at her, 73 years old, half-starved, barely able to walk without help, and saw absolute determination in her eyes. "You really are as stubborn as cricket," he said. "I believe you already mentioned that. Just wanted to make sure you heard me the first time." They rested for another 20 minutes, then continued on. The sun was lower now, painting the rocks in shades of amber and copper. Eli found his mind wandering as they walked, thinking about Margaret's mission, about the sites she was trying to save, about the fact that he'd lived his whole life in this desert without really understanding what it contained. Maybe Sarah had been right. Maybe he'd been walking through all this time without really seeing. They reached Eli's ranch just as the sun was touching the western horizon. Margaret had dozed in the saddle for the last hour, swaying with cricket's gentle rhythm, and Eli had to wake her carefully when they arrived. "We're here," he said, his hand on her arm. "You made it." Margaret blinked awake, disoriented for a moment, then focused on the adobe house in front of them. Even in the fading light, it was clear the place was well maintained, the walls freshly plastered, the porch swept clean, the small corral sturdy and square. A weathered windmill turned slowly in the evening breeze, and somewhere nearby, Eli heard the soft clucking of chickens settling in for the night. "It's lovely," Margaret said, and there was genuine appreciation in her voice. Eli helped her down from the saddle, supporting her when her legs threatened to buckle. "Easy now. You've been sitting for hours. Give yourself a minute to get steady." While Margaret leaned against the corral fence, Eli quickly unsaddled Cricket and turned the donkey into the corral with fresh water and a measure of grain. Then he guided Margaret toward the house, one arm supporting her as they climbed the 3 steps to the porch. "There's a spare room," he said, unlocking the door. "Used to be well. It's clean and the bed's comfortable. You'll stay there until you're strong enough to figure out what comes next." The interior of the house was simple but welcoming. Adobe walls kept it cool even in summer heat, and the furniture was solid and practical, a worn couch, a wooden table, shelves lined with books. Margaret's eyes went to the photographs on the mantel. Eli and a dark-haired woman at various ages, smiling in front of this same house, this same landscape. "Your wife," she said. "Sarah." Margaret nodded respectfully and didn't pry further. Eli appreciated that. He showed her to the spare room, which had been Sarah's sewing room, and then, after her death, a place where Eli stored things he couldn't quite throw away, but didn't need every day. He'd cleaned it out about 5 years ago during a fit of organization, put in a proper bed, and told himself he was preparing for guests who never came. "Bathrooms through there," he said, pointing. "Water might run brown for a minute, we're on a well, but it's clean. Towels in the cabinet. I'll get some food going while you clean up." Margaret stood in the doorway of the room, looking suddenly small and overwhelmed. For the first time since he'd found her, she seemed on the verge of tears. "Eli," she said quietly, "I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me. Just get yourself cleaned up and fed. Everything else can wait." He left her to it and went to the kitchen. His cooking repertoire was limited but reliable. Beef stew that he'd made in large batches and frozen, fresh bread from the bakery in town, canned green beans. Simple, but it would put strength back in Margaret's bones. While the stew warmed on the stove, Eli sat at the kitchen table and allowed himself to fully process what had happened. This morning he'd been planning a routine supply run. Now he had a 73-year-old geologist in his spare room, a woman with a mission that might get her killed if she wasn't careful, and decisions to make about how involved he wanted to get in something that wasn't really his business. The smart thing would be to feed her, let her rest for a few days, then drive her to town where she could contact whoever needed contacting, her family, if she had any. The authorities, maybe, to report her jeep and arrange for it to be towed. Then she could go back to wherever she came from, and Eli could return to his peaceful, solitary existence. That was the smart thing. But Eli kept thinking about those photographs. She'd shown him the ancient pictographs that would be destroyed, the sacred sites that would disappear under mining operations. He thought about Margaret spending 3 days arranging stones into an SOS while dying of thirst, and about her insistence that the work wasn't finished. He heard the shower running in the bathroom and realized how good it must feel for her to wash away 19 days of desert grit. Simple comforts. They mattered more than people realized. 20 minutes later, Margaret emerged, wearing clean clothes from her pack, different khaki pants, a faded blue shirt. Her silver hair was wet and combed back, and her face, scrubbed clean, showed just how much the desert had taken out of her. She looked exhausted but more human than before. "Something smells wonderful," she said. "Don't get your hopes up. I'm not much of a cook." They ate at the kitchen table, and Eli watched with satisfaction as Margaret worked, her way through 2 bowls of stew and 3 slices of bread. She ate slowly, methodically, and he could see color returning to her face with each bite. "This is the best meal I've had in months," she said. "Now I know you're still dehydrated. The delusions are setting in." Margaret laughed, a genuine, warm sound that seemed to surprise them both. "Fair enough. But it's still the best meal I've had in months." After dinner, Eli made coffee, and they took it out to the porch. The sun had set fully now, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. Eli gestured to the old rocking chair, Sarah's chair, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret sat down. "Tell me about the sights," Eli said, settling into the straight-back chair he preferred. "The ones you were documenting." Margaret cupped her hands around the warm coffee mug and gazed out at the darkening desert. "Where do I start?" "Wherever you want." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. When she spoke, her voice held a lecturer's cadence, the rhythm of someone who'd spent years teaching. The painted desert and surrounding lands have been inhabited for at least 12,000 years. The Clovis people, the ancestral Puebloans, the Hohokam, and more recently, the Hopi and Navajo nations. Each culture left marks on the landscape, not just physically, but spiritually. These weren't random settlements. They were chosen for specific reasons: water sources, defensive positions, astronomical alignments, spiritual significance. She paused to sip her coffee. "The site I was heading to when my jeep broke down, it's a canyon about 8 miles from where you found me. The walls are covered with petroglyphs dating back nearly 1,000 years. Star charts, ceremonial calendars, teaching symbols. The Hopi elders say it's one of their most sacred locations, a place where their ancestors gathered for important ceremonies. And Hearthstone Resources owns the mineral rights, purchased them from the federal government 18 months ago. Perfectly legal, perfectly destructive." Bitterness crept into Margaret's voice. "I've been trying to work with the tribal councils, help them build a case for historical preservation. But the legal system moves slowly, and Hearthstone moves fast. They're already building access roads, setting up staging areas. The mining operation could begin within 6 months. Eli rocked slowly in his chair, thinking, "So you decided to document everything yourself?" "Someone had to. The official surveys are incomplete, intentionally so in some cases. If I can create a comprehensive record, photographs, geological surveys, GPS coordinates, historical context, it might give the tribes more leverage in court. Or, at the very least, it will ensure that someone remembers what was destroyed." That's a lot to take on alone. I'm aware. Margaret set down her coffee cup and looked at him directly. I'm also aware that I nearly died trying. You don't need to. Say it. I know I was foolish to come out here without backup, without telling anyone exactly where I'd be. David would have given me hell for that kind of recklessness. But you'd do it again. It wasn't a question, and Margaret didn't treat it like one. Yes, I would. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets, a distant coyote, the wind moving through the junipers. Eli found himself thinking about purpose, about the things that made a person willing to risk everything. How long would it take, he asked finally, to document the remaining sites? Margaret looked at him sharply. Why? Just curious. It's not curiosity. You're considering something. She leaned forward slightly. What are you considering, Eli? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out at the stars, brilliant and infinite above the dark desert. Sarah used to sit in this very chair and talk about how small their problems seemed under a sky like this. How the land had been, here long before them, and would be here long after. How that should be humbling, not frightening. I'm considering, he said slowly, that maybe you shouldn't do this alone. Margaret stared at him for a long moment. You're offering to help. I'm saying it's a possibility worth discussing. Eli, you don't owe me anything beyond what you've already done. You saved my life. That's more than enough. He shook his head. This isn't about owing. This is about... He paused, searching for the right words. I've lived in this desert for 40 years. I thought I knew it. But listening to you talk about these sites, about what's going to be lost, I'm realizing I've been walking through history without seeing it. Maybe it's time I opened my eyes. It would be dangerous. The terrain alone. I know this country better than anyone alive. I know where the water sources are, which trails are passable, which canyons flood in a storm. If you're going to finish this survey, you need someone who can navigate this land. That's me. Margaret settled back in the rocking chair, studying him with those sharp geologist's eyes. You're serious? I don't say things I'm not serious about. What about your ranch? Your routine? You've built a life here. A lonely life, Eli interrupted. A peaceful life, yes, but lonely. Sarah used to say I had a bad habit of confusing solitude with contentment. He met Margaret's gaze. Maybe she was right. Maybe this is exactly the kind of thing I need to be doing, instead of just marking time until I'm too old to do anything at all. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's expression softened. How long would I need to rest before we could start? She asked. At least a week, maybe 2. You're dehydrated, malnourished and exhausted. We push too hard, too fast, and you'll end up in a hospital instead of a canyon. 2 weeks feels like forever when there are only 6 months before the mining starts. 2 weeks feels like nothing when you're dead, Eli countered. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Margaret nodded slowly. All right, 2 weeks to recover. Then we finish the survey together. She extended her hand. Deal. Eli shook it. Her grip was weak, but steady. Deal. The next morning, while Margaret slept late, recovering from her ordeal, Eli went to his storage shed and dug out boxes he hadn't touched in years. Old USGS topographic maps, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Survey notes from his days working for the Prescott Ranch, when he'd ridden every square mile of the high country mapping fence lines and water sources. Field guides to desert plants, geology, archaeology. Books that Sarah had bought him over the years, trying to kindle his interest in the land's deeper stories. He spread the maps across the kitchen table and began to study them with new eyes. Margaret had mentioned 47 sites. He needed to understand where they were, how they connected, what routes would be most efficient for reaching them all. When Margaret emerged around noon, looking rested but moving carefully, She found him surrounded by paper and making notes in a worn leather journal. "You're already planning," she said. "Trying to. I need to see your list of sites and their coordinates. Then I can start mapping the most practical routes." Margaret retrieved her metal case and opened it on the table beside his maps. Inside was a meticulously organized system site documentation sheets, photographs, GPS coordinates, geological surveys, historical notes. Everything labeled, everything cross-referenced. 40 years of professional fieldwork evident in every detail. "These are the 18 I've completed," she said, pulling out a folder. "And these are the 29 I still need to document." Eli studied the coordinates, then began marking them on his topographic maps. The sites were scattered across a vast area, some relatively accessible, others in remote canyons that would require serious hiking. Several were in terrain Eli knew well. Others were in places he'd only glimpsed from a distance. "This one," he said, pointing to a location on the map. "The canyon with the star charts. How far in is it?" "About 3 miles from the nearest point a vehicle can reach. Rough country, lots of boulder fields and dry waterfalls. I was planning to camp there overnight to complete the documentation." "And this cluster here?" He indicated 5 sites, marked close together in the northern section. Ancient pottery sites and granaries. The ancestral Puebloans used to store corn in sealed rooms built into cliff faces. Most of them have been looted over the years, but a few remain intact. They worked through the morning, Eli asking questions and Margaret providing details. Slowly, a picture emerged not just of individual sites, but of a landscape woven through with human history. People had lived in this desert for thousands of years, had thrived here, had created art, and built homes, and raised children in country that most modern Americans considered uninhabitable. "It changes how you see everything," Eli said finally. "Knowing all this is here. That's why I'm doing this," Margaret said. "Not just to create a record for the courts or the tribes, but because these stories deserve to be told. The land has a memory. Someone needs to remember along with it." Over the next week they fell into a routine. Margaret rested, ate regular meals, regained her strength. Eli continued planning, studying the maps, preparing equipment. He checked and repaired his camping gear, made lists of supplies they'd need, calculated distances and travel times. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and talked. Margaret told him about her decades of fieldwork, Chile's Atacama Desert, where it hadn't rained in 400 years, Mongolia's Gobi, where she'd discovered fossil beds that rewrote part of evolutionary history, Namibia's ancient sand seas that held secrets about climate change going back millions of years. Eli shared his own stories, though they seemed humble in comparison, learning to ranch from old-timers who'd been born in the 19th century. Building this house with Sarah, mixing adobe by hand. The year the drought got so bad they had to haul water from town for the livestock. Small stories, but they were his stories. Rooted in this specific piece of earth. "You know," Margaret said one evening, "most people spend their whole lives in one place and never really see it. You've lived here 40 years. But in the past week, you've learned more about this land than most people learn in a lifetime. Thanks to you. Thanks to both of us. You're showing me how to survive out here. I'm showing you what's worth surviving for." By the end of the second week, Margaret was moving without pain, and her color had fully returned. She'd put on weight from Eli's steady cooking, and her energy levels had rebounded. She looked less like a woman who'd nearly died in the desert, and more like what she was, a determined scientist with a mission to complete. "I think I'm ready," she announced one morning. Eli looked up from the supply list he was reviewing. "You sure? My knee feels solid, my strength is back, and we're running out of time." She gestured to the calendar on the wall. "We've used 2 weeks. That leaves us about 5.5 months before Hearthstone begins operations. 29 sites in 5 months. It's doable if we're efficient. Some of the sites are small, just a few hours of documentation. Others will take days. But if we work steadily and don't waste time, then we can finish. Eli nodded. All right, we start tomorrow. First sight is the canyon, with the star charts, the one you were heading to when your jeep broke down. Margaret smiled. Poetic. Finishing what I started. Exactly. Eli folded up his supply list. We'll take my truck as far as the access road goes, then hike in. 2 days to document everything properly, 1 day to hike back out, 3 days total, if the weather holds. And if it doesn't, then we get creative. He met her eyes. This is desert country, Margaret. We prepare for the worst and hope for the best. They left at dawn. Eli's old pickup truck loaded with camping gear, water containers, and Margaret's documentation equipment. The access road was barely more than a pair of tire tracks cutting through sage and creosote, and Eli drove slowly, picking his way around boulders and through sandy washes that could trap an unwary vehicle. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her GPS unit and notes, occasionally directing him toward waypoints she'd marked on her previous attempt to reach this site. Neither spoke much. The anticipation of what they were about to see filled the silence between them. After 2 hours of rough driving, they reached the end of the road where Margaret's abandoned jeep sat, listing to one side, its front tire flat and its transmission case cracked and leaking fluid onto the desert floor. There she is, Margaret said quietly. Betrayed by machinery. Eli examined the damage. We can have someone tow it out later. Right now, we've got other priorities. They shouldered their packs and began hiking. The canyon Margaret had been seeking lay 3 miles east, accessible only by foot through a landscape of broken rock and twisted juniper. Eli led the way, following game trails and natural corridors that only someone who truly knew this country would recognize. Margaret kept pace remarkably well, her hiking boots finding purchase on loose scree, her breathing steady despite the elevation gain. Every so often she'd stop to photograph a particular rock formation or make notes in her field journal, but she never asked to rest beyond what Eli had scheduled. By noon, they'd reached the canyon entrance, a narrow gap in the sandstone where centuries of flash floods had carved a passage through solid rock. The walls rose a bier, 100 feet on either side, striated in layers of red, orange, and cream that told stories of ancient seas and shifting continents. It's just ahead, Margaret said, consulting her GPS. Around this bend. They rounded the corner and stopped. The canyon opened into a natural amphitheater, where the walls curved inward, creating a sheltered space about 50 yards across. And covering those walls from ground level to 30 feet up were petroglyphs. Hundreds of them, spirals and handprints, human figures and geometric patterns, representations of animals both familiar and extinct. But dominating the western wall was something extraordinary. A massive circular design, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, composed of concentric rings and radiating lines that connected to various symbols around its perimeter. Dear God, Eli breathed. Margaret was already moving forward, her camera out, her face transformed by professional excitement. It's even more extensive than the preliminary surveys suggested. This isn't just a calendar, it's an entire astronomical knowledge system. She began photographing systematically, working from one end of the wall to the other, while Eli simply stood and stared. The circular design drew his eye again and again. Something about the precision of it, the careful placement of each carved line, spoke of sophisticated understanding that predated modern civilization by centuries. "What am I looking at?" he asked. Margaret paused in her photography. A calendar system that tracks solstices, equinoxes, and major stellar events. See these radiating lines? Each one corresponds to a significant astronomical occurrence. The ancestral Pueblones who created this understood planetary movements, eclipse cycles, seasonal markers, all without telescopes or modern instruments. She pointed to a cluster of symbols near the top of the design. Those marks there, they correspond to the Pleiades constellation, and these lower ones track the sun's path through the seasons. This entire wall is essentially a teaching tool and ceremonial guide combined. Elders would have brought younger members of the community here to explain the movements of the heavens and their connection to the agricultural calendar. Eli moved closer, reaching out to touch the rock face, then thinking better of it. How old is it? Based on the weathering patterns and the style of the carving, probably 900 to 1,000 years old. Maybe older. Margaret's voice held reverence. Think about that, Eli. While Europe was in the Dark Ages, people in this canyon were charting the stars and passing down knowledge that sustained entire communities. They spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the site. Margaret photographed every panel, every symbol, taking notes on size, orientation, relationship to other elements. She used a handheld GPS to mark exact coordinates and a compass to note the alignment of key symbols with cardinal directions. Eli helped where he could, holding measuring tapes, positioning reflectors to improve lighting for photographs, sketching rough maps of the amphitheater's layout. But mostly he watched and learned, seeing this place transform from just another canyon into a library, a classroom, a sacred space where knowledge had been preserved in stone. As the sun began to set, they made camp in a sheltered alcove at the canyon's far end. Eli built a small fire while Margaret continued reviewing her photographs and making notes. The firelight danced on the canyon walls, bringing the ancient petroglyphs to life, making them seem to move and breathe. "What happens to this when the mining starts?" Eli asked quietly. Margaret looked up from her laptop where she was organizing the day's images. "This specific canyon is about 4 miles from the primary lithium deposit. It might survive the initial excavation, but the blasting, the vibration, the change in groundwater flow, it will all cause damage. And if they expand the 2000 Tefni operation, which they almost certainly will, this entire area could end up as tailings, storage, or access roads. How can people not care about preserving this? They care. But they care more about lithium for batteries, about economic development, about quarterly profits." Margaret's voice was tired. "I'm not naive enough to think the world will choose a 1,000-year-old calendar over the materials needed for electric cars, but I can make sure there's a record. I can ensure that when this place is destroyed, it won't be forgotten." They ate dinner in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Eli found himself angry in a way he hadn't been in years, a deep, burning frustration at the casual destruction of something irreplaceable. This canyon had survived a millennium of weather, wars, and changing civilizations. It would not survive modern industrial development. "Tomorrow we document the auxiliary sites," Margaret said, breaking the silence. "There are 4 smaller panels, scattered through the side canyons, plus evidence of habitation structures, fire pits, storage areas, possibly a kiva. If we work efficiently, we can complete the full survey in 1 more day. Then that's what we'll do." That night, lying in his sleeping bag under a sky so filled with stars that the Milky Way looked like a river of light, Eli thought about the people who'd created those petroglyphs. They'd looked at these same stars, traced these same constellations, passed down knowledge from generation to generation. Their voices were silent now, but their work remained. At least for a little while longer. The next day, they documented everything Margaret had described: the auxiliary panels, the fire pits blackened by centuries-old flames, the remnants of structures that had sheltered families during harsh winters. Each discovery added layers to the story, filling in details about how people had actually lived in this seemingly inhospitable place. By late afternoon, they'd completed the documentation. Margaret packed away her equipment with obvious satisfaction. "That's 19, she said. 28 to go. 1 step at a time," Eli replied. "We'll get there." As they hiked back toward the truck, Eli took one last look at the canyon. The afternoon sun hit the western wall at an angle that made the circular calendar design seem to glow. He understood now why Margaret was willing to risk everything for this work. Some things were worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth remembering, even if the fight was already lost. Over the next 6 weeks, Eli and Margaret fell into a rhythm. They'd spend 3 or 4 days in the field documenting sites, then return to the ranch to rest, process data, and plan the next expedition. The work was physically demanding but deeply satisfying. Each canyon, each rock panel, each ancient structure they documented felt like a small victory against time and forgetting. They completed sites 19 through 31 without incident. A pottery manufacturing area where shards of beautiful black-on-white ceramics still littered the ground. A series of granaries built into cliff faces, the sealed doorways still intact after 8 centuries. A spring system surrounded by petroglyphs showing water symbols and prayers for rain. Each location added to their growing archive of photographs, GPS coordinates, and field notes. Margaret bloomed under the routine. The work animated her in ways that made her seem a decade younger. Her eyes sparkled when she explained the significance of a particular symbol or geological formation, and her laughter came more easily as they shared evenings around campfires, discussing everything from ancient astronomy to the best way to cook beans over an open flame. Eli found himself changing too. The loneliness that had defined his life since Sarah's death began to lift, replaced by purpose and partnership. He'd forgotten what it felt like to work towards something meaningful with someone else, to share the small triumphs and frustrations of daily effort. They were planning their next expedition, a cluster of 3 sites in a remote canyon system to the north, when everything changed. It started with something small. They were hiking toward Site 32, following Margaret's GPS coordinates through broken country studded with sage and prickly pear, when Eli noticed something that didn't belong. A bright orange plastic stake driven into the ground, about 3 feet tall, marked with numbers and letters in black ink. He stopped and examined it more closely. The markings read HSSURVEY, a 47N. "Margaret," he called, "come look at this." She joined him, and he watched her face go pale as she read the stake. "Hearthstone," she said. "HS, Hearthstone Resources. Survey stake. Preliminary site survey. They use these to mark boundaries, test drilling locations, access road routes." She pulled out her GPS unit and checked their position, then cross-referenced it with her site documentation. "We're less than a quarter mile from the petroglyph site we were heading to. This stake shouldn't be here. They're not supposed to begin any ground survey work until they have final permits, and those aren't expected for another 4 months. They continued forward and found more stakes. Dozens of them, forming a grid pattern that stretched across the landscape. And then, cresting a small rise, they saw it. A cleared area about the size of a football field, scraped down to bare rock. Heavy equipment tire tracks crisscrossed the space, and in one corner sat a pile of core samples, cylindrical sections of rock extracted from test drilling operations. "They've already started," Margaret said, her voice tight with anger. "They're conducting preliminary mining operations without permits, without environmental reviews, without consulting the tribal councils." Eli examined the core samples. They were fresh, the exposed rock still showed. Moisture, and some of the drilling equipment nearby looked like it had been used within the past few days. "Is this legal?" he asked. "Absolutely not. The mineral rights give them permission to eventually extract resources, but they're required to complete extensive environmental and cultural surveys first, obtain permits, and allow time for public comment and tribal consultation. This," she gestured at the cleared area, "this is claim jumping into the process by months, maybe a year." They documented everything. Margaret photographed the stakes, the cleared area, the core samples. She took GPS coordinates and made detailed notes. Eli helped by measuring the extent of the disturbance and collecting identifying information from the equipment. When they finally hiked to the petroglyph site they'd originally been seeking, they found it partially damaged. The vibrations from nearby test drilling had caused a section of the rock wall to fracture and collapse, taking several panels of Dacian, ancient art with it. What remained was beautiful, stylized figures of deer and bighorn sheep, geometric patterns that might have represented clan symbols, but the destruction was heartbreaking. Margaret stood before the damaged wall with tears running down her face. "This is what I was trying to prevent," she said. "Not just eventual destruction, but this casual disregard for irreplaceable history. They didn't even look to see what they were destroying." That evening, back at the ranch, they sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's laptop between them, reviewing the day's photographs and trying to decide what to do. "We have to report this," Margaret said. "The Bureau of Land Management, the State Historic Preservation Office, maybe the EPA. This is illegal activity, and it's causing damage to protected cultural resources. Will they care?" Eli asked, though he already suspected the answer. "They should care. But in practice," Margaret sighed, "these agencies are understaffed, overwhelmed, and often sympathetic to development interests. We file a complaint, it goes into a queue, someone eventually investigates, and by then Hearthstone has probably completed their preliminary surveys and secured the permits they should have waited for in the first place. So we document it, add it to your archive, make sure there's a record." "Yes, but that's not enough anymore." Margaret's voice hardened. "I thought I was just creating a historical record. Now I realize we might have evidence of actual illegal activity. That changes things." She opened her email and began composing messages to various agencies, attaching photographs and GPS coordinates. Eli watched her work, admiring her precision and determination, even as he felt a growing unease. They were no longer just documenting history, they were challenging a major corporation's operations. That felt like crossing a line into territory where the stakes were much higher. Over the next 3 days, as they continued their documentation, work on nearby sites, Margaret's emails began getting responses. Most were bureaucratic and non-committal. "We'll look into it. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We'll add it to the review process." But one response was different. It came from a lawyer named Patricia Whitehorse, who worked with the Hopi Tribal Council. She'd been following the Hearthstone situation closely and was very interested in the evidence Margaret and Eli had collected. "This could be exactly what we need," Patricia wrote. "We've been trying to slow down Hearthstone's timeline, force them to properly consult with tribal authorities. Evidence of premature development activities could give us grounds for an injunction. Would you be willing to provide testimony and documentation?" Margaret read the email aloud to Eli, then looked at him expectantly. "This is your decision," he said. "I'm here to help you document sites, whatever else you want to do with that. Information that's up to you. But it affects you too. If we provide testimony, we'll be publicly opposing Hearthstone, a company with more lawyers and money than we could ever imagine. There could be consequences." Eli thought about the damaged petroglyph wall, about the orange survey stakes scattered across sacred ground, about corporations that saw thousand-year-old art as just another obstacle to quarterly profits. "Sarah used to say that doing the right thing wasn't always the same as doing the safe thing," he said finally. "I think she'd want us to help." Margaret smiled, a fierce, determined expression. "Then we help." She responded to Patricia Whitehorse's email, agreeing to provide documentation and testimony. Within hours, she received a reply asking them to meet with tribal representatives and legal counsel in 2 days. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He stood on the porch, looking at the stars, thinking about how quickly his quiet life had transformed. 2 months ago, his biggest concern was whether to buy supplies in Sedona or drive the extra distance to Flagstaff. Now he was preparing to testify against a major mining corporation in support of tribal land rights. Cricket wandered over to the fence and made a soft sound. Eli went to him, scratching the old donkey's ears. "Well, old friend," he said quietly, "looks like we're in it now, whatever it turns out to be. The donkey just looked at him with those calm, knowing eyes, and Eli felt oddly reassured. He'd made his choice. Now he'd have to live with wherever it led. The meeting with Patricia Whitehorse and the tribal representatives took place in a small conference room at the Hopi Cultural Center. Eli and Margaret arrived early, both dressed more formally than they'd been in months. Margaret in clean khakis and a pressed shirt, Eli in the one sport coat he owned that still fit. Patricia was a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back in a traditional bun and a metafety briefcase that looked like it had survived several legal battles. She greeted them warmly, then introduced the three tribal elders who joined them: Thomas Lomakema, Agnes Poliastiva, and Harold Sekakwapteva. "Thank you for coming," Thomas said, his weathered hands folded on the table in front of him. "Patricia has told us about your work documenting the sacred sites. This is important to us, not just legally, but spiritually. These places hold our history, our teachings. To see them destroyed," he paused, emotion crossing his face, "it would be like burning our libraries and churches." Margaret opened her laptop and began showing them the documentation she and Eli had compiled. Photographs of petroglyphs and pottery sites, GPS coordinates, geological surveys, and most importantly, evidence of Hearthstone's premature development activities. The elders leaned forward, studying each image intently. When Margaret showed them the photograph of the damaged calendar site, Agnes made a soft sound of distress. "I have been to this place," she said quietly. "My grandmother took me there when I was a girl. She taught me to read the calendar, to understand the seasons. Now it is broken." Patricia took notes furiously as Margaret walked through the evidence. "This is good, very good. The preliminary development activities give us grounds for an immediate complaint to the BLM. And your documentation of the sites provides the cultural evidence we need to argue for expanded protections." "Can you stop the mining?" Eli asked. Patricia hesitated. "Stop it completely? Probably not. Hearthstone has legal mineral rights, and the economic pressure to develop lithium resources is intense. But we might be able to slow them down, force them to avoid the most sensitive areas, ensure proper consultation and mitigation measures." "Might," Margaret said. "Not will. I won't lie to you. We're fighting uphill against powerful interests, but your evidence gives us more leverage than we've had. That matters." They spent 3 hours going through everything: the documentation process, the specific sites, the timeline of Hearthstone's activities. Patricia explained the legal strategy. They'd file complaints with federal agencies, seek an injunction to halt preliminary work until proper reviews were completed, and leverage media attention to pressure the company into better practices. "We'll need you to be willing to testify," Patricia said, "both in administrative hearings and possibly in court. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Yes," Eli nodded. "Whatever you need." Thomas reached across the table and clasped their hands. "You honor our ancestors. With this work, whatever happens with the legal case, you have given us something precious, a record of what we are fighting to protect. That will not be forgotten." After the meeting, Patricia walked them to their truck. "I need to be straight with you," she said. "Hearthstone is going to fight back. They have a lot to lose if we succeed in delaying their timeline. They'll try to discredit your work, question your credentials, maybe even suggest you're trespassing or interfering with legal activities. Are you ready for that?" "We've documented everything carefully," Margaret said. "The science is solid." "I believe you. But this isn't just about science, it's about money and politics. Be prepared for things to get uncomfortable." She was right. 2 days later, Eli received a certified letter from a law firm representing Hearthstone Resources. It informed him that he and Dr. Margaret Chen were hereby notified that any interference with lawful survey activities on land where Hearthstone held mineral rights would be considered trespassing and would result in legal action. Furthermore, any public statements or testimony regarding Hearthstone's operations should be based on verified facts, as the company would vigorously defend itself against defamation. It wasn't quite a threat, but it was close enough to make Eli's jaw tighten. Margaret received a similar letter, along with a follow-up email from someone claiming to be a Hearthstone community relations manager. The email was friendly in tone but clear in message. The company respected her scientific work, but she should understand that lithium mining would bring jobs and economic benefits to the region. Perhaps they could work together to find solutions that balance development with preservation. "They're trying to buy me off," Margaret said, showing Eli the email. "Or at least neutralize me. Are you worried?" "I'm furious." She deleted the email with a decisive click. They damaged sacred sites without permits, and now they want to talk about balance and cooperation? No, thank you. Despite the corporate pressure, or perhaps because of it, they threw themselves back into the documentation work with renewed urgency. They had 16 sites remaining, and now there was genuine concern that Hearthstone might accelerate their preliminary activities to establish facts on the ground before any injunction could be granted. The next 3 weeks became a blur of hard travel and intensive documentation. They worked longer days, pushed deeper into remote country, documented sites with thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. Margaret photographed everything from multiple angles, made detailed sketch maps, recorded extensive field notes. Eli helped with measuring, GPS marking, and increasingly with understanding what they were seeing. He developed an eye for the patterns now, could recognize different styles of petroglyphs, understand the significance of particular locations, appreciate the astronomical alignments that ancient builders had incorporated into their structures. The desert was revealing itself to him in ways he'd never imagined, and he found himself grateful for the education. Site 37 was a kiva, a ceremonial chamber built partially underground, with a restored ladder descending through the roof opening. Thomas Lomakema had insisted on accompanying them to this location, saying it was too sacred to document without proper protocol. He performed a blessing before they began work, speaking in Hopi and sprinkling cornmeal in the 4 cardinal directions. Then he explained the kiva's significance, how it represented emergence from earlier worlds, how it was used for ceremonies and teaching, how every element of its construction held symbolic meaning. "My grandfather was initiated here," Thomas said, his voice echoing slightly in the underground chamber, "as his grandfather before him. This is not just history to us. This is living tradition." Margaret documented everything with reverence, and Eli understood why this work mattered so deeply. They weren't just preserving archaeological sites, they were protecting connections between living people and their ancestral past. By the end of October, they'd completed 43 of the 47 sites. Only 4 remained, but they were the most difficult, deep in backcountry that required multi-day pack trips with no vehicle access. They'd need a full week, maybe more, to reach and document all of them. "We should do it all at once," Margaret said, studying the maps. "One extended trip. We pack enough supplies for 8 days, document all 4 sites, then hike out." Eli considered the logistics. 8 days in the backcountry with an elderly woman, carrying all their food and water, navigating rough terrain. It was ambitious, maybe foolish, but they'd come this far. "We'll need perfect weather," he said, "and we'll need to be smart about water sources." "There's a spring system here," Margaret pointed to the map, "between sites 44 and 45. And another here, near site 47. If we time it right, we can refill along the way." They spent 2 days preparing. Eli checked and rechecked equipment, calculated food and water needs, planned their route with obsessive care. Margaret organized her documentation supplies, charged batteries, verified GPS waypoints. The evening before they were set to leave, Patricia Whitehorse called. "The BLM is going to investigate," she said. "Based on the evidence you provided, they're sending an inspector to verify the unauthorized development activities." It won't happen for another 3 weeks, but it's happening. That's good news, Margaret said. It's a start. But I wanted to warn you, Hearthstone knows the inspection is coming. They're going to be scrambling to either clean up evidence or expedite their permit applications. Things might get more aggressive out there. After the call, Eli and Margaret sat on the porch in silence, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. We could wait, Eli said finally. Let the legal process play out before we finish the documentation. And if Hearthstone uses those 3 weeks to damage the remaining sites? Margaret shook her head. No. We finish what we started. Then whatever happens legally, at least we'll have a complete record. It's a risk. Everything worthwhile is. She looked at him, and in the fading light her expression was determined but peaceful. Sarah was right about you, you know. What do you mean? You said she told you not to leave this place, not to give up on it. I think she knew you needed more than just solitude. You needed purpose. Something worth fighting for. Margaret smiled. You've found it. We both have. Eli thought about his life before he'd spotted that SOS in the desert. The quiet days, the predictable routine, the slow drift toward becoming irrelevant. Then he thought about the past 3 months, the sites they'd documented, the stories they'd preserved, the stand they were taking against casual destruction. Tomorrow we finish it, he said. All of it. Together. Together. They set out before dawn with packs that felt heavy but manageable. Eli had learned, over the months, exactly what Margaret could carry and had distributed the weight accordingly. The route would take them northwest into country he'd only visited once or twice in 40 years, remote even by desert standards, accessible only to those willing to walk. The first day passed without incident. They made good time despite the heavy packs, reaching Site 44 by mid-afternoon. It was a small rock shelter with faded pictographs showing what appeared to be a migration story, human figures walking in a line, carrying bundles, following a star or sun symbol. Margaret documented it efficiently, working with the practiced speed that came from having done this 43 times before. Eli helped measure panel dimensions and mark GPS coordinates, their partnership now so smooth it required few words. They camped that night in a sheltered canyon, building a small fire and eating freeze-dried meals that tasted better than they should have after a hard day's walk. The stars emerged in their thousands, and Margaret pulled out her late husband's brass compass, the one she'd carried on every field expedition for 30 years. "David gave me this on our wedding day," she said, turning it in her hands so the firelight caught the engraved inscription. "He said as long as I had it, I'd never be truly lost." Eli watched her trace the letters with her finger. "Has it been true?" "Mostly. Though I suppose getting stranded in the desert and building an SOS out of rocks suggests the compass isn't foolproof." She smiled. "But yes, it's guided me through some hard country, both literal and metaphorical. I like to think David's still looking out for me. I think he probably is." They reached Site 45 the next morning, a complex of ancient dwellings built into a cliff alcove, with intact roof beams showing tree-ring dates from the late 1200s. The structures were remarkably preserved, protected from weather by the overhanging rock. Margaret spent hours photographing every detail while Eli explored the surrounding area, finding pottery sherds, stone tools, and evidence of agricultural terraces on the slopes below. It was while documenting Site 46 the following day that they encountered the Hearthstone crew. Eli heard them before he saw them, the sound of equipment echoing off canyon walls, out of place in this silent wilderness. He and Margaret were approaching the site, which was supposed to be a petroglyph panel in a narrow side canyon, when voices carried on the wind. They moved cautiously forward and found 2 men in hard hats and high-visibility vests using a portable drill rig to extract core samples from the canyon floor. A 3rd man was taking photographs and making notes on a tablet. The men looked up as Eli and Margaret emerged from behind a jumble of boulders. "This is private land," one of the men said immediately. "You're trespassing." Eli kept his voice calm. "This is federal land, Bureau of Land Management. No, one owns it. Hearthstone Resources has mineral rights, which gives us access for survey purposes. You need to leave." Margaret stepped forward, her camera visible around her neck. "Are you aware that you're operating within 200 meters of a protected archaeological site? Federal law requires cultural surveys and permits before this kind of exploratory work." The man with the tablet. Clearly, the supervisor studied them more carefully. "You're the ones who've been filing complaints. The geologist and her—" He paused, glancing at Eli. "Associate. We're documenting cultural resources," Margaret said, "which you're currently threatening with unauthorized drilling operations. Our operations are fully authorized. We have mineral rights. Mineral rights don't give you permission to bypass environmental and cultural review processes. I've been doing this work for 40 years. I know the regulations." The supervisor's expression hardened. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave this area. If you refuse, I'll have no choice but to call the county sheriff." "Please do," Margaret said. "I'd be very interested to hear what the sheriff thinks about unlicensed drilling operations near protected sites." For a tense moment, the two groups faced each other. Then the supervisor pulled out a satellite phone and stepped away to make a call. Eli moved closer to Margaret. "This could get complicated," he said quietly. "It already is complicated. But we're not leaving. That petroglyph panel is 50 yards from here, and we need to document it before their drilling damages it." The supervisor returned, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff's Department says this is a civil matter, not criminal. But they're sending a deputy to sort it out. You're welcome to wait here and explain your presence." "We'll wait," Margaret said. What followed was an uncomfortable standoff. The Hearthstone crew continued their work, while Eli and Margaret moved to document the petroglyph site they'd come for. The panel showed elaborate hunting scenes, bighorn sheep pursued by human figures with atlatls, the ancient spear-throwing weapons that predated bows and arrows. Margaret photographed methodically, refusing to be hurried despite the situation. Eli kept watch on the drilling crew, noting exactly what they were doing and where. An hour later, a sheriff's SUV bounced into view, following what must have been an access road on the far side of the canyon. The deputy who emerged from the SUV was a weathered man in his 50s named Garcia. Eli recognized him from town. They'd had coffee together a few times over the years at the local diner. Garcia surveyed the scene with the careful neutrality of someone who'd dealt with too many disputes over desert land. "Eli Boone," he said, approaching. "Didn't expect to find you out here. Didn't expect to be here under these circumstances," Eli replied. Garcia listened to both sides. The Hearthstone supervisor explained that they were conducting legitimate survey work within their mineral rights area. Margaret countered with citations of federal regulations regarding archaeological protection and permit requirements. The deputy took notes, photographed the drilling equipment and the nearby petroglyph panel, and made several phone calls to verify claims. After 30 minutes, he delivered his assessment. "Here's the situation," he said. "The land is federal BLM property. Hearthstone has mineral rights, which gives them legal access for survey purposes. However," he looked at the supervisor, "regulations do require cultural resource surveys and permits before exploratory drilling, especially this close to documented archaeological sites. I'm going to have to ask you to cease operations until you can show me proper permits." The supervisor's jaw tightened. "We have authorization from corporate legal. I need to see federal permits, not corporate authorization. Until you can produce those, this equipment stays off. We'll have them by tomorrow. Then you can resume work tomorrow. For now, you're done here." Garcia turned to Eli and Margaret. "You two are within your rights to be here for legitimate research purposes. But I'm asking you as a favor not to antagonize these folks. Let the legal system sort this out. We're just documenting sites," Margaret said. "We don't want confrontation. We just want to finish our work." Garcia nodded. Fair enough. I'm going to file a report on this incident. Might help with whatever case the tribal council is building. He glanced at the drilling rig. Number 4. Between you and me, I've got cousins on the Hopi reservation. I know what these sites mean to people. But I can't take sides. I just enforce what the law says is legal or not. After he left, the Hearthstone crew packed their equipment with barely concealed frustration and departed. Eli and Margaret finished documenting the petroglyph panel in silence, both aware that they'd crossed some invisible threshold. This was no longer just about preservation. It had become a legal battle with witnesses, reports, and consequences. One more site, Margaret said as they shouldered their packs. Just one more. Site 47 was the most remote of all, a full day's hike into canyon country so rugged that Eli questioned whether they'd find it at all. Margaret's GPS coordinates led them through a maze of slot canyons and boulder fields, along ancient trails that only someone with geological training would recognize as paths. They reached it at sunset on their 6th day in the backcountry. And it was magnificent. A natural cave, high on a canyon wall, accessible only by a series of hand and toe holes carved into the rock face. Inside the cave, protected from weather for perhaps 1,500 years, were pictographs so vivid they looked like they'd been painted yesterday. Spirals and handprints, yes, but also elaborate scenes showing ceremonies, dances, migrations, an entire cultural narrative preserved in ochre and charcoal. Eli helped Margaret climb to the cave entrance, spotting her as she ascended the ancient handholds. Once inside, they simply stood for a moment, awed by what they were seeing. "This is what we've been fighting for," Margaret said quietly. "All of it has been leading to this." She documented everything with painstaking care as the last light faded. Eli assisted with measurements and photographs, and when it grew too dark to see properly, they set up their camp on a ledge near the cave entrance. That night, sitting with their backs against stone that had sheltered humans for millennia, they talked about what came next. "The documentation is complete," Margaret said. 47 sites, thousands of photographs, comprehensive GPS coordinates, and field notes. Whatever happens with the legal case, we've created a record. Patricia said the BLM inspection is in 2 weeks, which gives Hearthstone 2 weeks to either hide evidence or push through. Permits before anyone looks too closely. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "We did what we could. Now it's up to lawyers and government agencies." "You sound resigned to failure." "I'm realistic about odds. Hearthstone has resources we can't match. But I'm also at peace with what we've accomplished. We bore witness, Eli. That matters, even if we don't win." Eli looked out at the star-filled sky, thinking about his life before that SOS in the desert. He'd been content, he supposed, but also slowly fading into irrelevance. These past months had given him purpose, partnership, and something worth fighting for. "Whatever happens," he said, "I'm grateful. For all of it." Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. "So am I." They descended the next morning, beginning the 3-day hike back to civilization. The work was done. Now, they'd wait to see if it made any difference. 3 months later, Eli sat on his porch, watching the winter sun paint the desert in shades of rose and amber. Cricket stood in the corral, content with his evening grain, and smoke rose from the chimney of the adobe house. It was a scene he'd witnessed thousands of times before, but it felt different now. Everything felt different. The legal outcome had been what Patricia Whitehorse called a partial victory. The BLM investigation, supported by Eli and Margaret's documentation, had confirmed unauthorized development activities. Hearthstone Resources received substantial fines and was ordered to conduct full cultural and environmental reviews before proceeding. The reviews would take at least a year, maybe 2. During that time, the most sensitive sites would receive additional protections. The Calendar Canyon, where Eli and Margaret had done their first documentation together, was designated as a protected area. Mining operations would have to route around it. Other sites weren't so lucky. The economic pressure for lithium extraction was too powerful, the mineral deposits too valuable. Hearthstone would eventually proceed with mining, and many of the sites Eli and Margaret had documented would be destroyed. But the timeline had been slowed, the process forced into transparency, and the tribal councils had been given a seat at the table they'd previously been denied. It wasn't everything Margaret had hoped for, but it was something. She lived in the guest room, now a semi-permanent arrangement that neither of them had formally discussed, but both had quietly accepted. Her Jeep had been towed and repaired, and she'd made several trips back to California to settle her affairs and ship boxes of belongings to Arizona. "I'm too old to maintain a house I'm never at," she'd said when Eli asked about it. "And you've got room here, unless you're tired of the company." He'd told her she could stay as long as she wanted. The past 3 months had been busy in ways that didn't involve hiking remote canyons. Margaret had compiled all their documentation into a comprehensive archive, more than 3,000 photographs, detailed field notes, GPS coordinates, geological surveys, and historical context for each site. She'd written a book-length report documenting not just the sites themselves, but the threats they faced and the broader context of indigenous land rights and cultural preservation. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office had published it, and academic institutions were already requesting copies for their libraries. Margaret had been invited to give presentations at universities, museums, and tribal centers. She'd become, somewhat to her surprise, a minor celebrity in archaeological and preservation circles. Eli had accompanied her to several of the presentations, sitting in the audience while she showed photographs of sites they'd documented together and explained why they mattered. He was always struck by how the images captured not just ancient art, but the feeling of those places, the silence, the scale, the sense of deep time. After one presentation at Northern Arizona University, a young graduate student had approached them. "Dr. Chen, Mr. Boone, what you've done, documenting all these sites before they're destroyed, it's inspired me to focus my doctoral research on preservation documentation. I want to do what you've done, create records that outlast the physical sites." Margaret had squeezed Eli's hand as they watched the student walk away. "That's how change happens," she'd said. "One person at a time, deciding it matters enough to act." Now, in the fading winter light, Eli heard the screen door open, and Margaret joined him on the porch, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She'd taken to making it in the evening, claiming it helped her sleep despite all scientific evidence to the contrary. Eli suspected she just liked the ritual of it. "Patricia called," Margaret said, settling into Sarah's rocking chair. "The tribal council wants us to attend a ceremony next month. They're officially designating several of the sites. We documented as sacred cultural properties. There will be speeches, traditional blessings. They want to honor our contribution. That's kind of them, more than kind. It's recognition that the work mattered." She sipped her coffee. "I've been thinking about what comes next. There's more work to do? There's always more work to do. The Navajo Nation has sites that need documentation. The Tohono O'odham in southern Arizona. The Paiute in Nevada." Margaret looked at him over the rim of her mug. "I'm too old to do it all myself. But maybe, if I had a partner who knew the country, who understood why it mattered, maybe we could help." Eli found himself smiling. "Are you offering me a job, Dr. Chen?" "I'm suggesting a partnership. You bring the navigation and survival skills. I bring the scientific expertise. We document sites that need documenting. We create records that will outlast us. And we make sure these stories don't disappear without someone bearing witness." It was exactly the kind of offer Sarah would have urged him to accept. A purpose that extended beyond himself, work that mattered, partnership with someone who shared his values. "I'll need to hire someone to look after the ranch when we're in the field," he said. "Is that a yes?" That's a yes. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and another answered. The desert, settling into its ancient rhythms, indifferent to human concerns, but willing to share its secrets with those patient enough to listen. Eli thought about the day he'd spotted that SOS from the canyon rim, how it had seemed like an interruption to his peaceful routine, an unwanted complication. How wrong he'd been. Margaret had given him more than just a project or a cause. She'd reminded him that life wasn't over just because you'd reached a certain age, that purpose could be found at any stage if you were willing to look for it, that the world still needed people who cared enough to act even when the outcome was uncertain. "Thank you," he said quietly. Margaret glanced at him. "For what?" "For building that SOS. For being stubborn enough to survive until I found you, for pulling me out of a life that was comfortable but small. Eli, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You saved my life. Maybe we saved each other." She smiled and raised her coffee mug in a small toast. "To second chances, then, and to bearing witness." Eli touched his mug to hers. "To bearing witness." They sat together as darkness settled over the desert, two people who'd found purpose and partnership in the most unlikely of circumstances. The ancient sites they documented would someday disappear, victims of progress and economic necessity, but they would not be forgotten. The record would remain photographs and field notes and GPS coordinates, yes, but more than that. Stories, memories, proof that someone had cared enough to look, to see, to remember. In the end, that was all anyone could do. Bear witness to what mattered, preserve what could be preserved, and pass the story forward to those who'd carry it next. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything